Welcome to what is the very first episode of Nineworks TV. As you can see in front of me, we have the 993 Generation 911, the last ever air-cooled 911, so particularly revered among enthusiasts. This particular car is owned by my buddy Andy, who's also my co-presenter on the podcast, Nineworks Radio. You can find it on Buzzsprout and your preferred podcast station. On to the car itself. The last air-cooled 911 was designed, believe it or not, by a Yorkshireman, Mr. Tony Hatter. And I managed to catch around 45-minute conversation with him as part of my series catching up with designers of different generations of 911. It's seriously interesting. It covers everything on the 993 from concept through to production, and then the different model variants such as Coupe, Turbo and Targa. Here's what Mr. Hatter had to say. Mr. Tony Hatter, legendary designer of the Porsche 993, among many other
Less
things.
of the legend.
Your input at Porsche has been seismic, hence why I reserve the right to use the word legend for now. So look, designer responsible for the 993, heavily involved with the GT1 program as well. There's a small side note by way of a Carrera GT. I'm not sure if people have heard of that car. I wonder what that went on to do. You have had quite a history at Porsche. 35 years ago, you joined the company as well. What does it mean to you to have worked for Porsche for such a long time?
First of all, it's a great honor. Secondly, it's hard to believe that I actually achieved a childhood goal to work for Porsche in the end. And the one or two sidetracks throughout my career at Porsche where I thought, well, you could go there and do something else and earn a bit more money. But I never did that, and I stayed on, and I'm pleased I stayed on and lived out my dream, as it were.
I wonder if you wouldn't mind briefly kind of just telling people about your journey.
So I was born in Newcastle, actually, but then I was brought up in Yorkshire, and I went to a school in Yorkshire. We lived near Leeds, and everybody, apart from me and perhaps one other guy, was a football freak. And I never got into football. So I was just cars. You hardly ever saw an exotic car around in those days. I remember distinctly that at grammar school, my best friend's dad had an E-Type Jag, which was fantastic, but my dad drove around in a Vauxhall Cresta and things like that. So I didn't really have that much connection to cars, but it was cars. And my parents decided, well, in that case, your career has to go in an engineering direction, because up in Yorkshire, nobody had heard of industrial design or anything like that. I was channeled into a mechanical engineering course at school, and then an ordinary national diploma in technology in Harrogate, and then I went to Sheffield to study mechanical engineering, which I flunked in the first year. And it's during that year I found out that there was an industrial design course with brackets transportation at Lancaster Polytechnic in Coventry. And I got in there just at the time when this ecology stuff was all happening. I think probably been one of the fuel crises, I'm not sure. And the tutors there were all dead against anything to do with car design. It's planned obsolescence. It's ugly. It's not, you've got design mobility schemes for cities or whatever, anything other than car design. So I spent 4 years with a great bunch of guys doing all sorts of other sort of transport projects, but I still wanted to do car design, and I managed to get into the Royal College on the basis of stuff I've been doing in evenings and so on. And I got into the Royal College in London, and I spent 2 years there, which was that was the catalyst to get me into this job. And from there, I applied initially to Porsche, which I didn't manage to get in because there were no places, but I also applied to Opel. And before I knew it, I was working in Germany, but for a company about 200 k's down the road from Porsche. So then I applied to Porsche, and I got into Porsche in '86. And but I wasn't really aware of how the Porsche styling studio had happened, and how all these things came together. In '73, the Porsche family had to leave the company. And that included Butzi Porsche, who was the head of the design department. So then the company set up their own design department with Anatole Lapine, who took with him and he was working for Opel, and he took with him the chief modeler, Peter Reisinger, Wolfgang Möbius, and they were basically General Motors guys, which then I was also then a General Motor guy coming to Porsche, but I hadn't realized there was this history behind me. And, but even the architecture, when I got to the studio, it was a claustrophobic effect because it was a miniature version of the design studio from Opel in Germany. It was identical, except it was about a quarter of the size. The last point about that is, a couple of years ago, Ed Wellburn was visiting was programmed to visit the Frankfurt show. Ed Wellburn was at that time the General Motors chief designer. And I was contacted whether Ed Wellburn and his chiefs of staff, you know, Pontiac, Holden, all these things, could come and have a look at our brand new design studio in Bicep, because 3 years ago we moved, or was it 4? We moved into a huge new purpose-built facility. So they arrive in these buses and stuff, and I get to show Ed Wellburn and his staff our new design center, which I think is really ironic. So there's a huge GM connection to Porsche.
I've read elsewhere, and you've just alluded to here, that you always wanted to work for Porsche. So I'd like to know, what was the kind of celestial moment that made you realise that?
Well, it probably is a cliche, but I went to Leeds on the bus with my best friend to see Le Mans, the film of Steve McQueen driving that 911 to the track. You know, it doesn't say much, but it's just the car and then the 917. And I think the racing scenes are fantastic. And I just knew that that's it.
I wanted to know what it was like when you first stepped into Porsche in 1986, like both for you personally, but also what was the company like?
The company was now in the midst of bringing out this amazing 959. And all the test cars at Bicep were guards red. All the 959s, you can see miles of them, all guards red. And this was the awesome car that was coming out. So I was feeling a bit in awe of this. But then in the studio, there wasn't really, apart from that, much happening. We're constantly being called up at the last minute to do graphics for racing cars. Little bits and pieces.
One of your first jobs was looking at the rear bumper of the 964 Turbo.
The steel fenders were the same as on the G model, but the plastic bumpers had to be flared into that. I remember supervising that. And when I got there, that's right, there's a project called the 984. This was a mid-engined two-seater roadster with an elaborate folding roof, very small. This was the project that everybody was hoping that would come through, a small entry-level Porsche, which ultimately became was behind the Boxster, I suppose.
Yeah. But
this was happening when I got there. And another naive take on that period, I don't think I knew exactly what state the company was in. It was only later when Harm Guy took over and we were realizing that we had to get the Boxster and the 996 through, that we realized that the company was really bad.
Okay, Tony, so you're, in terms of like 911, you've obviously started with the rear of the 964 Turbo. I've then read as well that you were designing the pawl straps on the 964 RS for the doors. How did it feel for you just kind of getting your hands dirty, if you like, on Porsche's hallowed 911 from the start?
It was difficult. As I said, there were some people already there, and you walk in and it's difficult to get going in that place, and there weren't that many projects, so there was no meat to have.
It's quite a meteoric rise, I would say, to join the company in '86, be responsible for those gubbins, if you like, on the 964, to then in a matter of years be heading, or be, you know, the 993 style was your design.
That happened perhaps being in the right place at the right time again. Harm Guy and Dr. Bates cooked up the 989. And this was the project where everybody was working on this project. And it didn't leave much time for anything else, except the 911 still had to be taken care of. And I was more than pleased to be able to work on that project. I worked on it with one other guy, I think. But eventually I was the only guy working on it, which was great. It just kind of happened. We didn't have difficulties. We did probably what we wanted to do. Without asking much. It was just a great project. It
kind of almost carte blanche within the sphere of the 911, which we all know has to look the same but slightly different.
That was this, and the 911. Even doing one today, it's a tightrope walk.
Yeah.
You just have to watch out. You can't take it too far away from a 911, otherwise it's not a 911. You can't do too little. At least from a design point of view, the 964 was perhaps too little. If you look at the 959 and the 928 specifically, there are shapes and forms in both those cars which of course found themselves into the 993. My goal was to get the front and the rear balanced, because the 964 become high at the front and low at the back, so it's kind of looked a bit like that, to balance it out. In the plan shape, to get as much plan shape in there as possible, to use the word Coke bottle, which has been probably used too often. The wider body has another 25 mil on each side, so it has a beautiful Coke bottle and tapering towards the rear. Of course, the headlights, you can see the 959 in there, and the 928 in the treatment of the highlights in the fenders.
Does that come from above, where Porsche is saying, look, we would like some DNA of 959 into this car?
I didn't know, nothing came from above. It's all design department. In those days, the design department was left to do that kind of stuff on their own. Yeah. It was a very technically orientated company. And as long as the wheels fitted into the wheel wells, they didn't really care what the rest of it looked like.
Pinky Lie with the 996 has said that for the 996 development of design, you were split up into teams, or you all submitted your own sort of ideas, and his was chosen. Obviously, with yours, it sounds like there was no competition.
There was no competition. The other guy working with me, we did two sides, I think. One side just slightly different. And it just kind of evolved.
You have essentially there got the future of the company, kind of the short-term future of the company, resting on your shoulders.
Completely not aware of that in the slightest in those days.
So from initial concept and design to final production car, how different are the designs?
There's always a time when you have to say stop. The car's finished. Put the clay modeling tools down and push it, and there was this push it into the measuring room, which is literally what happened. But I got a second shot at the car to correct or to continue doing some things that I really wanted to do, and that was the turbo. So I got a second shot at doing another front end and the rear end.
When you say you got a second shot to design the front end, why is that? Did the company say, look, we want some sort of split between the turbo model and the narrow body?
Well, this is exactly, because none of the turbos were different to the normal 911s. This was the first time they did a turbo with its own specific front end, which is great. It wasn't always going to happen because the front end is not wider than the normal car, so it wasn't a given, but obviously they had enough funds to do it.
Did you know at the time that this was going to be the last air-cooled car?
We suspected, and we knew the horsepower would be over 400. And I remember we were all thinking, wow, a production car with 400 horsepower, that's unheard of.
Yeah.
We just can't get any better. It can't get any more than this. This car's going to win Le Mans, this is amazing. Yeah, it was a bit awe-inspiring. And we were particularly aware of that when the last special edition, I came up with the idea with doing a split grille on the spoiler.
Yes, that was on the 2S, wasn't it?
Yeah, that thing there.
What was the mood like, Tony, at the company at the time when you were designing what you all highly suspected would be the end of an era with the air-cooled 911? Was there, almost resentment that the next car wouldn't be air-cooled?
No, and we all understood that because the engine was at the end of its development. It was something that could not be avoided, and if it came with ease of manufacturing and better fulfill the regulations. And I'm a member of an air-cooled club, or one or two air-cooled clubs, and I love air-cooled cars and air-cooled stuff. But in those days, that was the technology advancing into the future.
Yeah.
The 962 had water-cooled or fluid-cooled heads, so it was something that was slowly happening anyway. So the plant was becoming automated, or much more automated.
Yeah.
Tolerances on the body, as you say, from 963 were just not acceptable anymore. So that's why there's still some rather wide shut lines on the 993. It's still trying to disguise the tolerances. But the rear brake light, the high-mounted brake light on the coupe, which is at the top of the rear window, has a very wide shut line. Because if we had made it any smaller, you would have seen that it didn't sit properly because of the tolerances from left to right. things like that we had to take into account. So we were at the end of modifying that body.
Yeah, okay. I've read elsewhere that you did want to have a bit of a play with the rain gutters, but in the end they had to kind of remain as they were originally from '63.
I think if you cut them off, I think the car would fall to bits just like a Mini. I think it's that kind of technology. I don't know. The 959 is a composite roof that didn't have rain gutters.
Agree,
so I don't know what would happen if they cut them off.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So they had to stay then.
Yeah.
The windscreen wipers on the 993, they are redesigned from the 964, aren't they?
Well, I don't know why it came about, because the windscreen wipers are crap on a 911, and they park around on the center of the curvature. Yeah. So just after a couple of weeks, the rubber's already taken the form of a curvature, and it doesn't wipe. And they're brilliant. I have a 993, as I said before. It's in the rain, it's great.
It's amazing, really, that it took until 1993, so fully 30 years after the car came around, for somebody to fix that. So
exactly, yes, exactly. But you have to think that was a huge change in the body, bringing the pivots in and
yeah.
I've
read elsewhere that rear axle steering was first trialed on the 993 911. Is that correct or not?
We had a lot of problem with tire clearance at the rear, and I wonder whether that was because of allowing some extra clearance for that effect. I'm not sure. Could be. In the end, it's not on this model. We had a terrible problem with the way the wheel sat in the wheel arch, and we had to change the inner wheel arch to make this gap smaller.
How do you remember the car being received initially by the board then?
Very, very enthusiastically. Very enthusiastically.
The 993 was obviously in terms of the early days, the air-cooled 911, it was a fairly radical change from the 964's appearance. But the interior was fairly similar. So were you guys allowed to change the interior, or did you decide, look, form over function, everything works fine, we're going to leave it? Or?
We're not allowed to change the interior. We changed the doors, and I did that stereo speaker and the doors. The 964 speakers were off-the-shelf speakers, I think.
Yeah.
And the 993 speakers are specific 993 door speakers.
Where the company weren't allowed to change, or decided that the interior generally wasn't allowed to be changed, was that for reasons of budget or anything else?
There isn't much to change, really. There's the 5 instruments thing, and then a little bit of a stubby center console. There isn't really much you could change.
With the Targa, obviously the 993 Targa was a huge step change for that particular model. And obviously I imagine the plan from the start was make the Targa look more like the coupe, or hold on to that line.
Yeah, that was the idea. Now, parallel to the 993, at least at the beginning of the project, Steve Merkert did the Panamericana. And if you look at that, you can see the Targa in that. And Steve did the Targa. He took that graphic and put it onto the 911, which works very well. So always the difficulty, and that was the difficulty on this car, was because there's an amazing morph. If you look on the internet, you might find it, of how the height of the rear of the 911 rises up until the 962s, somewhere about here, and it's trying to get this line, the roof line, down to flow into the rear bumper. You can even see on this model, it looks a bit dodgy around here, and that was a nightmare. And then I did the cabriolet roof, which kind of flows much better. Yeah. The Targa was also a similar difficult job. That's the hard part.
I suppose that follows on quite nicely, Tony. And this is something I've asked every designer I've spoken to so far who's designed a generation of 911. So you are responsible for, as we said earlier, doing something the same but different. How on earth do you find the balance, and how as a designer do you approach that? Because it is such a difficult line to tread down.
It is a difficult line. And as I said before, you've got to know when to stop. You can always carry on. And somebody has to say stop, that's it.
How does that make you feel today? You designed the last air-cooled Porsche 911.
Yes, well, it's funny you should say this. It's great, but it's not as if I walk around every day and think, oh, pat my back. It's only in retrospect. Oh, wow, yeah, that is something. But
You're very humble. You're very, very humble.
Yeah, after the 993 project, I became a guinea pig. There's one or two of us in the company, and this is where the digital age was starting. And I became a guinea pig, and I was learning to build surfaces in a computer. And up until then, building surfaces in a computer was something for very, very skilled engineers, and something that most designers didn't want to have anything to do with. I wasn't all that competent in that system, but Harm said, look, we've got to do this project. Get in touch with this guy after the summer holidays. And it turned out they needed the GT1 done in no time flat. And the only way to do that would be to construct these surfaces in a computer. So I did some sketches, milled out the thing, and it didn't change very much. It ended up on the starting grid at Le Mans like 9 months later. So that's an incredible thing to happen. But it meant like I started the project, managed the project, knew what was happening and knew how to do it. Then we did the Evo, and then we did the 98 car, which eventually won. And what was great was that Norbert Singer was our aerodynamic guy, so it was putting the band back together again.
What was it like working with Mr. Singer?
I love him. He's great. Love him. Very pragmatic, and he's probably, if he watches or listens to this, he probably reprimand me, but he's one of the old school, and he'd have his steel ruler, you know, and we'd be on the computer and doing stuff on the computer, and it'd be difficult for him to kind of get into there and watch what we're doing. So we would mill stuff, and he wouldn't really have much control over what we did until he could see it in clay on a model or on a full size. And then he could whip out his slide rule and calculate things. So great fun working with him.
There's a fantastic anecdote I've heard about your role specifically on race day at the Le Mans in 1998, when Porsche was finally able to take outright victory again. Would you mind just kind of divulging what you got up to?
Everybody goes to Le Mans has to have a job. And I spent 8 days at Le Mans, and we also had the two Just cars, the open topped WEC cars,
yeah,
and our two cars. So there were 4 cars. Each car has a daytime front, nighttime front, spare daytime front, spare nighttime front, spare rears, spare doors. So there are truckloads of parts, and I'd been responsible for all the graphics on these cars. I'd even spent time at Just taping up these cars with a company called Becker, who did most of the graphic works with us. And I spent 7 or 6 days just doing taping and graphics and stuff on all these parts and cars, because the graphics, we had a brilliant idea to make graphics that flow from the fender onto the door, then over the door onto the rear fender. So you'd have to have all these parts together to make sure the graphics lined up with each other. Absolutely brilliant. I don't know who thought of it, but that's what we ended up doing. So it was, I won't call it a nightmare, but we didn't get much sleep over those days, getting all those parts done. But even so, when the flag falls, there are no more graphics things to tape up. So I got, one of the jobs was to be a scout in the pits. And I had to watch the Panos and the Nissan cars and take note of when they came into the pits, whether they changed wheels, whether they changed driver. We had this truck in the pits where all the other guys who'd been engineering the cars, they had also got second jobs, which was to compile the information on the competitors.
Yeah.
So that was great fun. And towards the end of the race, Nissan became the only near competitor that could even harm us. So it was all a bit exciting. And I'll never forget it. And there are guys that do this every year. Yeah, or imagine the Formula One team, they do it every bloody weekend. So yeah. For me, it was great.
As you've intimated, Tony, so to bring it round to Carrera GT, you've proven that you have the ability to execute a project from start to finish. From a design point of view, was it quite refreshing to have almost a blank piece of paper in comparison to the 993?
The Carrera GT was was a project that was done with a lot of guys. Porsche Design had opened up a studio in the States, so it was done there, and the show cars were done in the States with a number of guys. And I think when we hadn't shown the car, but I went over to make sure that I could get all the data I needed to make a production car. So I got that, I got everything measured of what the stage that they had then when I went over. It was probably around Christmas time in 2000. Yeah, and then came back, and then that's when I started doing the road version or the series production version. I haven't asked Harm why, but Harm said, Tony, you're going to do this project. You're going to take this car and make a production car out of this modified Boxster, which is what the Carrera GT show car was. It was basically a Boxster with a huge engine tacked onto the back. The car in the States had coolers, radiators behind the doors, at a very small front, had no roof, and that was the job, to make a series production car that had a roof on a very limited budget. Norbert Singer got involved immediately, and he said, well, if you're going to have the radiators behind the doors like the show car, they're going to be sticking out about half a meter on each side, so the radiators have to be at the front. So the car changed drastically. It got, I think, a 20 centimeter wheelbase was lengthened, and the front became much wider. Anyway, the car is completely different to the show car. So we made a model in the computer and milled it, and it looked awful. And I thought, it wasn't an easy project. It took about a year to get that car done. We had a studio outside of Weissach in the next village. It wasn't very easy. The interior also had to be completely redone, because the concept that they had like a skeleton inside, aluminium and parts. You can't have hard parts in a car, so everything we did had to be covered in absorption materials and so on. So we redid the interior and completely redid the exterior, and thought up a concept for the roof. All the time we would have weekly meetings with Harm and the board, and they really wanted the show car, which wasn't possible. There were so many cost constraints on that car.
I didn't realize there were so many financial constraints on it, because to me, when you look at that car, I think you assume that Porsche's like throwing the checkbook at it.
No, it very nearly did not happen.
Just from a cost point of view, it was just
from a cost point of view, and also from we started everything was being done new. There was nothing apart from the hidden door handles. The door hinges are from a Mercedes-Benz. It's just everywhere. Things were costing money, and it was just getting out of control. And Dr. Wiedeking was not very happy.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So what got it over the line in the end then?
I think it just looked great. I think the engine just sounded fantastic.
Yeah.
I think it was a feeling, we've got to make this car. Similar to the Le Mans story, we have press events. They rented a huge bomber airstrip north of Berlin, which is about 4 miles long, to launch this car to the press. And I was there for a week, and I think Walter Röhrl was there, and test drivers and so on. And we had 6 cars, and in the morning and afternoon, we would have perhaps 2 groups in the morning, 2 groups in the afternoon of journalists from different countries and so on. And they'd get to experience the full speed with Walter Röhrl. And that was incredible. You sat there in the passenger seat with a box between your legs with a digital readout about that big, so you can see how fast. And to get just before the end of the runway, I saw 327 kilometers an hour on that box. That's not the speedometer, that was proper time. Anyway, so they got that. Then there was a slalom course, and then they got a road book, and these journalists were allowed to go out on this course. Now in the slalom, there was an accident, and there was an accident outside as well. And then it became, wait a minute, we've got to do something here. So who's not doing anything? Oh, there's the designer standing there. He's done his 5 minutes this morning, so he gets the job. You have to be the pace car for these crazy journalists. So I got Roland Kussmaul's red GT3.
Yeah.
And I had to take every group of journalists out on this 50 or 100-mile road trip, twice in the morning, twice in the afternoon, with a GT3.
That's absolutely
and
awesome.
So you get onto the autobahn, and they were not de-restricted autobahns. They had speed limits. It's very rare you find a German autobahn with no speed limits these days. But journalists didn't know that, and they just wanted to get past me and get up to 327 kilometers an hour. So anyway, I was leading one group on the autobahn one afternoon, and I came up to a roadblock. The police had blocked off the autobahn with police cars. I thought, okay, fair cop, you know, we've been doing this all day and we haven't been caught. And they funneled us all off into the filling station. And I don't know what nationality the journalists were, but none of them could speak German. And I didn't have any papers for any of the cars. And I thought, what on earth? What it turned out was they thought the cars had been stolen. Somebody from the press department had arrived to sort things out. But I thought, Christ, I'm going to be locked up for good here.
What were you up to, Tony, kind of from there then until when you left Porsche last year in 2020?
I became, we broke up the department into different categories of jobs, and I became sports car manager. That meant basically the box, the Cayman and the 911 and the various GT3s and GT2s. So I looked after the management side of those design projects for, I think, about 12 years, because then by this time Miguel Mauer joined.
Yeah. And
that was the system we had. Then there was a guy who looked after the Panamera projects, and the guy who looked after the four-wheel drive projects.
Yeah, okay.
So that was my job. Yeah. And then we had another reorganization, and I got my own department where we took care of what happens to the car, what happens to the design intent after the design job's finished. It's not as if you say, right, there's the clay model, where's the next project? Our team, we had interior, color and trim, and exterior people to look after the surfacing of this car in the tooling stage, getting it into production right until it leaves the production line, and then the quality audits and so on when the car is finally produced. So that was my final job when I left.
Yeah. Sounds like lots of paperwork on that last job.
Paperwork, yeah, and suddenly, so a late stage in my life, suddenly have personnel to look after something new for me, rather than say, right, take that line. You know, it's not just taping of a model anymore. It's it became management. How
does it make you feel to have left the company, and what are kind of your overriding thoughts and memories on the company?
I cannot believe it's over. I still have contact with colleagues and friends and so on, and I'm still heavily involved in old Porsches and so on. I've got a couple, and that keeps me busy, and one or two other projects.
Tony, in that regard, I'm so grateful for your time this afternoon in imparting these stories and anecdotes onto us as enthusiasts. It really is splendid to hear it.
I'm just amazed at the amount of interest in the historical stuff. It's fantastic. I love it, and keep up the good work. That's all I can say.